The file was never meant to be opened again. It sat on a steel shelf inside a federal records vault, boxed in faded cardboard, stamped with a case number that hadn't been typed into any modern database. The ink was yellowing. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and metal. To most people, it was just another unresolved disappearance from another forgotten decade. But this file was different, not because it held a shocking confession, not because it named a killer, not because it revealed a hidden witness. It was different because the answer had been there the entire time, and no one saw it. The case began the way so many disappearances do, quietly, without spectacle, without warning, without the kind of chaos that forces the world to pay attention. On a cool autumn morning, a teenage girl left her house for school and never arrived. No scream, no struggle, no eyewitnesses, no ransom note. Her name was entered into police logs. Flyers were printed. Search teams combed nearby woods. A missing person report was filed within hours. By nightfall, the word abduction had already begun circulating among investigators, because when a child vanishes without a trace, the mind immediately reaches for the worst explanation. And once that assumption settles in, it becomes almost impossible to see anything else. Her bedroom showed no signs of a struggle. Her clothes were neatly folded. Her diary ended mid-sentence the night before. The final line describing something ordinary: homework, a television show, a passing thought about the future. There were no farewell messages, no indications of running away. The front door had been locked behind her. Her backpack was never found. By the second day, the FBI was notified, not because there was evidence of a federal crime, but because the absence itself was alarming. No footprints, no torn fabric, no witnesses who could agree on anything, just a girl who had stepped into the morning and dissolved. The Bureau opened a file, and from that moment forward, everything about the case began to narrow. Profiles were drawn, suspects were categorized, theories were prioritized. Investigators focused outward on highways, strangers, predators, known offenders, nearby cities. They examined traffic cameras miles away. They interviewed truck drivers, bus operators, gas station clerks. They searched for movement. What they didn't search for was stillness, because stillness looks like nothing, and nothing is easy to ignore. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. Public interest faded. The girl's face stopped appearing on television screens. New cases replaced the old ones, but the file remained active. Inside it were hundreds of pages, maps, interviews, lab reports, handwritten notes from agents who believed, sincerely, that they were getting closer. In reality, they were circling the answer without ever seeing it. Years later, long after the original agents had retired, a routine audit of unresolved cases triggered a quiet review. No media attention, no task force, just one analyst assigned to verify whether the file should be archived permanently. She wasn't looking for revelations. She was looking for paperwork errors. Her job was procedural: confirm dates, ensure reports were properly logged, verify that all physical evidence was accounted for. It was the kind of work done in silence, surrounded by old cases that never had endings. That was when she noticed something wrong. Not something dramatic. Something small. A discrepancy so minor it had survived decades without being questioned. One evidence log didn't match the narrative summary. A piece of evidence had been collected on the first day of the investigation, logged, labeled, photographed, and stored. But it was never referenced again in any follow-up report. Not by local police, not by federal agents, not by lab technicians. It existed only as an entry, a single line in a list. At first glance, it meant nothing. But evidence doesn't collect itself. Someone had picked it up, someone had bagged it, someone had decided it mattered, and then everyone forgot about it. The analyst pulled the original chain of custody form. The handwriting was rushed, the kind that comes from chaotic scenes where officers are trying to document everything at once. The item description was vague, almost careless, but the location where it had been found was precise, very precise, too precise for something meaningless. The analyst requested the physical evidence from storage. It took 3 days to locate it. When the box finally arrived, it looked unremarkable. Brown paper, evidence tape long since brittle, a barcode printed in an outdated format. Inside was a sealed bag. Inside the bag was an object that had been examined before, but never understood. Not because investigators were incompetent, but because they were looking for the wrong thing. From the beginning, the case had been framed as a disappearance, which meant every piece of evidence was interpreted as supporting that assumption. The girl had left. The girl had been taken. The girl had gone somewhere. No one asked a question that would have changed everything. What if she never went anywhere at all? The object in the bag wasn't bloody. It wasn't torn. It wasn't obviously connected to violence. It was something that belonged exactly where it was found, so ordinary that it blended into the background of the crime scene itself. That was the trick. Criminals often hide things by concealing them. This case hid the truth by leaving it in plain sight. When the analyst compared the evidence log with the original scene photographs, her stomach tightened. The object appeared in multiple images, always present, always ignored, always dismissed as irrelevant environmental clutter. It had been photographed dozens of times, and no one had ever zoomed in, because the human brain is trained to filter out what it believes it already understands. Investigators thought they were looking at a location the girl passed through. They never considered it might be where she stayed. The analyst escalated the finding. Quietly. No press release. No announcements. Just an internal memo flagged potential oversight. The file was pulled from archival review and reassigned to a small internal unit, specializing in anomalous cold cases where something fundamental had been missed. When the unit reviewed the evidence, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every timeline assumption relied on the belief that the girl exited the environment, but there was no evidence of her leaving, only assumptions that she must have. The new team reconstructed the case from scratch, stripping away decades of narrative. They treated the scene not as a departure point, but as a closed system. And suddenly, the evidence told a completely different story. The location where the girl was last seen wasn't just near the disappearance. It was the disappearance. The object logged on day one was not incidental. It was central. It had been misidentified because investigators didn't think to question its category. They labeled it as environmental debris. But it wasn't debris. It was part of the scene, and part of her. The realization didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrived as a slow, creeping dread. Because if the conclusion was correct, it meant the girl hadn't been hidden from investigators. She had been cataloged by them, stored, moved, re-examined, ignored, all while everyone searched the world outside. The evidence was reprocessed using modern techniques unavailable at the time of collection: microscopic analysis, material breakdown, trace examination. What they found contradicted everything written in the original reports. The object contained biological markers, not blood, not tissue, something more subtle, something that only makes sense if the body was never removed, if it was transformed, if the crime wasn't about disappearance at all but about misdirection. The case file was reopened officially, not as a missing person investigation, but as a concealed presence case. The classification alone sent a chill through the unit, because those cases are rare, and when they exist, they are never accidents. Someone had known exactly how investigators think, exactly how evidence is categorized, exactly what would be overlooked. The girl had not vanished into the night. She had been absorbed into the environment investigators trusted most, the place they believed they understood, the place they searched over and over and never questioned. By the time the Bureau realized the truth, decades had passed. The people responsible were older or gone, but the evidence remained. Patient, silent, waiting inside the file that was never supposed to be opened again. And in part two, the investigation would take a terrifying turn, because once agents understood where the girl had been hiding all along, they were forced to confront how it had been done and why no one noticed. Because the most disturbing crimes are not the ones hidden in darkness. They are the ones hidden inside procedure. When the case was officially reopened, the first thing the Bureau did was something deceptively simple. They stopped asking who. No suspects, no profiles, no persons of interest, because the question of who assumes a crime already understood, and this crime was not. Instead, they asked how the evidence behaved. That decision alone altered everything. The object once dismissed as environmental debris was removed from storage and placed under controlled examination, not as a relic, not as a curiosity, but as a primary witness that had never been allowed to testify. Its surface told a story investigators had overlooked for decades, not because it was unreadable, but because it didn't match any crime they believed they were investigating. Traditional abductions leave familiar signatures, drag marks, fibers, footprints, blood transfer, forced entry, disruption. This object showed none of those. Instead, it showed consistency, uniform exposure, gradual accumulation, a timeline written not in violence but in patience. That was the first red flag. Crimes of passion are chaotic. Crimes of opportunity are sloppy. This was neither. This was controlled. The analysts noticed microlayering on the object's surface, thin deposits that accumulated over time, environmental buildup that suggested prolonged presence in a fixed location, no sudden displacement, no movement across varied terrains, which meant one thing: the object hadn't traveled, it had stayed. The assumption that the girl left the scene collapsed under that realization, because the evidence tied to her had never left either. Investigators re-examined every photograph taken during the original search. Hundreds of images once skimmed were now studied frame by frame. Digital enhancements revealed patterns previously dismissed as shadows or texture. The object appeared again and again, unchanged, in early photos, in later photos, before search teams arrived. After they left, it had been stepped around, photographed over, documented without being questioned. Because it belonged. At least it looked like it did. The new team reconstructed the original crime scene exactly as it existed on the day of the disappearance. Measurements were verified, angles recalculated, sightlines tested, and then they did something no one had done before. They stood exactly where investigators had stood decades earlier, and saw exactly what they had seen. Nothing. That was the genius of it. The object didn't hide the girl. It replaced her. Human perception is trained to recognize anomalies, not absences. When something fits, the brain relaxes. It stops interrogating. The object fits so well into the environment that it effectively erased the girl's absence by filling the visual gap where she should have been noticed. This wasn't concealment, it was camouflage. The laboratory results deepened the unease. Advanced analysis revealed trace biological material embedded in the object, not in a way consistent with injury, but with prolonged integration. Cellular remnants bonded over time, not transferred in a single event, which suggested transformation, not metaphorical, physical, the kind that happens slowly, deliberately. The team realized they were no longer investigating a disappearance. They were investigating a process, and processes imply planning. Someone had not panicked. Someone had not reacted. Someone had executed. The case files revealed something else, something even more disturbing. During the original search, investigators had expanded the perimeter multiple times. They searched farther, not closer. Each expansion assumed outward movement, vehicles, roads, trails. They never shrank the perimeter. They never asked if the center was complete. That bias had consequences. Every canine search began away from the location, not within it. Dogs trained to track movement found nothing because there had been none. Search teams dismissed the lack of scent as evidence of removal. It was evidence of stasis. The new unit reviewed the training manuals used at the time. They found nothing incorrect, just one missing instruction. There was no protocol for cases where the victim never leaves the scene but ceases to be recognizable as a victim. Because those cases are not supposed to exist, yet here it was. The object was reclassified. No longer debris, no longer environmental. It became a container, not in the traditional sense, but in the way evidence sometimes carries more than it admits. As investigators traced how the object had been handled, a chilling detail emerged. It had been relocated multiple times, moved during searches, shifted during documentation, handled by gloved hands, and each time it remained unremarkable because no one thought to ask what it used to be. The file revealed interviews with people who had been near the scene that morning, witnesses who recalled seeing nothing unusual. That phrase appeared repeatedly. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, nothing strange. Those statements were no longer reassuring. They were indictments. The team began mapping perception failures, points where investigators subconsciously decided what mattered before examining it, and they realized something unsettling. The environment itself had participated in the crime, not intentionally, but predictably. Human systems rely on categorization. Evidence is either relevant or irrelevant. Once assigned, that label becomes sticky. Challenging it requires discomfort, and discomfort is expensive. The person responsible had exploited that, not by outsmarting investigators, but by understanding them. The timeline was rewritten. The girl was last seen entering the location. She was never seen exiting. There was no verified moment of removal. The object appeared immediately afterward, and then remained. The implication was horrifying. The act had occurred within minutes, and the concealment had lasted decades. The FBI quietly consulted specialists outside traditional criminal investigation experts in material science, industrial processes, environmental engineering, because whatever had been done to the girl, it wasn't impulsive. It was technical, and it required knowledge. The evidence suggested familiarity with how substances degrade, how surfaces weather, how long it takes for something foreign to become invisible. This was not about hiding a body. It was about erasing a category. The girl had not been buried. She had been redefined. By the time the team reached this conclusion, the case no longer felt historical. It felt active, as if the evidence had been waiting for someone to finally ask the correct question. And the most chilling question remained unanswered. If this had worked once, how many other cases had failed the same way? How many disappearances were disappearances at all? How many victims were never moved, never buried, never found because they were never looked for in the right form? The Bureau restricted access to the reopened file, not out of secrecy, but out of fear of contamination. Once you see a case this way, you can't unsee it. And it changes how you look at every unsolved mystery. In Part 3, the investigation would cross a line it could never step back from, because identifying how the girl had been hidden would force agents to confront who had the expertise to do it, and whether the method had been used before. Because the evidence was no longer silent, it was accusing, and it was pointing somewhere investigators had never thought to look. Once investigators understood that the girl had not been removed from the scene but transformed within it, the case stopped behaving like a cold case. It began behaving like a warning. The Bureau's internal unit faced a realization that unsettled even seasoned agents. Identifying the method mattered more than identifying the person. Because a method can repeat, a person may not. They returned again to the object, not as a container, not as camouflage, but as a process endpoint. Whatever had been done to the girl had reached a stable state. The object was not temporary. It was not meant to be reversed. That suggested intent beyond concealment. It suggested permanence. The team reconstructed the hours following the girl's last confirmed sighting with forensic precision. Weather conditions, temperature, humidity, ambient noise, human traffic patterns. They examined how long someone could remain unseen in that environment without raising suspicion. The answer was uncomfortable. Long enough, especially if the person didn't look like a person anymore. The method, once theorized, was devastating in its simplicity. It relied on no extraordinary technology, no exotic materials, no advanced equipment beyond what was accessible at the time. What it required was knowledge-specific, niche, procedural knowledge of how environments accept foreign elements. The team consulted experts who had never expected to be part of a criminal investigation, people who worked with surfaces, materials, degradation, and long-term exposure, individuals who understood how objects stop being noticed. One expert said something that never left the room. Most crimes fail because they fight entropy. This one worked because it cooperated with it. The girl hadn't been hidden from the environment. She had been surrendered to it. The Bureau began reviewing the professional backgrounds of individuals connected to the location: maintenance workers, contractors, inspectors, specialists who understood the site not as a place people pass through, but as a system that persists. The suspect pool narrowed without anyone being named, because patterns don't accuse loudly, they whisper. Records revealed that modifications had been made to the environment shortly before the disappearance. Routine work, logged as mundane, signed off without comment. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual. Except in hindsight, one alteration aligned too well with the timeline. Something installed, repaired, or adjusted just days before the girl vanished. It had been documented, approved, inspected, and then forgotten. The realization was crushing. The crime hadn't required secrecy. It had required permission. The individual responsible didn't bypass systems. They used them. They didn't hide from oversight. They satisfied it. That understanding reframed the entire case. This wasn't a predator hunting in shadows. This was someone operating in daylight, shielded by legitimacy, protected by routine. The object, the endpoint of the process, was not improvised. Its integration into the environment had been planned to survive scrutiny, to withstand search teams, to endure documentation. The perpetrator had known investigators would come, had prepared for them. The Bureau quietly cross-referenced similar unsolved disappearances, not by location but by context. Places where victims vanished without evidence of exit, where searches expanded outward endlessly, where environments were assumed neutral. The results were sobering. There were others, not identical, but disturbingly familiar. Cases dismissed as runaways, as accidents, as anomalies. The same investigative assumptions, the same outward focus, the same blind center. The implication was terrifying. This was not an isolated crime. It was a method that exploited a flaw in how investigations are taught. And once you know the flaw exists, you see it everywhere. The team returned to the original location one final time, not to search, but to observe. To stand still and let the environment speak. What struck them most was how ordinary everything felt. Nothing looked sinister. Nothing demanded attention, which meant the crime had succeeded perfectly. The girl had not been erased violently. She had been normalized. And normalization is the most effective form of disappearance. The FBI faced a dilemma. Revealing the truth publicly would not bring justice in the conventional sense. Too much time had passed, evidence degraded, individuals aged, retired, died. But not revealing it meant the method remained invisible, and invisible methods repeat. The Bureau chose restraint. The case was closed quietly, not as solved, not as unsolved, but as understood. The file was updated with a classification rarely used and never discussed outside internal circles, one that acknowledged the failure was not an effort, but in perception. The girl's name was added to a list not of missing persons, but of identified victims whose location had always been known but never recognized. She had not been lost. She had been overlooked. And that was the most unsettling conclusion of all. Because it meant the danger was not monsters or shadows or dark roads at night. The danger was familiarity. The places we stop questioning, the objects we decide are harmless, the procedures we trust so completely that we stop seeing what passes through them. The girl had been hiding inside the evidence all along, not because she wanted to be found, but because no one thought to look at what they were already holding. And somewhere, in another file, on another shelf, another piece of evidence might still be waiting, silent, patient, perfectly ordinary, until someone finally asks the wrong question and accidentally discovers the right answer.